Hi, my name's Cole Allen, and I am a policy analyst at the Oklahoma Policy Institute. And today I want to talk to you about State Question 846, which will be on your August 25th ballot. We hope that this video will help you be vote ready in August. So, what is State Question 846? So, earlier this year, the legislature passed a bill called Senate Joint Resolution 47 to amend the state constitution by a vote of the people, and that created State Question 846. What this state question does is it adds a new section to Article 3 of our Oklahoma State Constitution that does two things. First, it adds new language to the Constitution to require ID for all methods of voting. And second, it directs the legislature to specify those voter ID requirements. You might be thinking to yourself, but wait, doesn't Oklahoma already require voter ID? And the answer is yes, and we've required ID to vote since 2011. You see, in 2010, the Oklahoma State Legislature referred State Question 746 to the Oklahoma voters. And this state question created many of the voter ID requirements that we have today. It went into effect in 2011. Part of the reason that the legislature referred State Question 746 to the people was to bypass then Governor Brad Henry, who had vetoed a very similar bill in 2009. So what are these requirements that we have today to vote? Currently, Oklahoma requires that people voting in person present a photo ID issued by the federal, state, or a tribal government, or the voter ID card issued by the county election board when someone registered to vote. People voting by mail need to have their ballots notarized, which also requires that you prove your identity to the notary. These requirements live in state statute, which the legislature has the power to update directly as it needs, and has done so several times the last 15 years. So how does State Question 846 change things if we already have voter ID requirements in Oklahoma? So to start, what State Question 846 does not do is it does not directly change the specific existing voter ID requirements that we have today. Instead, it creates a new set of broader requirements that voter ID laws will need to meet. And this is because the Constitution overrides statute. It also gives the legislature new authority over voter ID laws. So let's look at the proposed constitutional language directly to better understand what's actually going on. So the language that would be added to our Constitution if State Question 846 passes in August is, each voter shall present proof of identity to the appropriate election official when voting at any election authorized by law and conducted by a county election board or the state election board. Proof of identity shall be required for any method of voting authorized by law. The legislature shall enact laws necessary to specify the requirements for proof of identity for voting as required by this section. Put simply, what this language is saying is that every voter will need to present proof of identity to the appropriate election official when voting, regardless of voting method, and that the legislature has the power to specify what these requirements are. So when looking at this language, there are a few key words and key requirements that the legislature will need to specify and make sure all of our existing and future voter ID laws meet up with. And these could have a very big impact on how people across Oklahoma can access the ballot. And so these words are present. The legislature will need to make sure it defines what it means to present your proof of identity. It also will have the power to further define what proof of identity means. For in-person voting currently, that means a photo ID or your voter ID card. But this could give the legislature broader authority to change this definition. The legislature will need to make sure that the appropriate election official is defined for each method of voting. And again, this will all have to work for any method of voting. This is either current methods of voting, like in person or vote by mail, or any that develop in the future as needs progress. And so all this taken together means that some things likely won't change immediately. But there are two important methods of voting that will likely be impacted by this amendment. That is provisional voting and mail-in voting. What is provisional voting and why is it important? Like I mentioned earlier, Oklahoma requires people to show ID to the election workers when they vote in person. However, sometimes people show up without an ID. They might have forgotten it at home or it could be expired. So instead of people simply being denied the opportunity to vote altogether, Oklahoma allows what is called a provisional ballot. And people get to cast this by first filling out an affidavit, which is a legal document, with their voter registration information. This is their name, their address, their driver's license, social security number, etc. Only if the election board finds that this information matches their voter registration information is that ballot counted. It's not put in the machine directly, it is kept separately and only counted if this information matches. So provisional ballots are really important for ensuring that every registered voter has the opportunity to vote, while also making sure that only registered voters are able to vote in Oklahoma's elections. Provisional voting exists largely because federal law requires that states issue provisional ballots to people when a question arises about that person's eligibility to vote. So this is guided by federal law, but Oklahoma sets a lot of the specifics. So if State Question 846 passes and has these new requirements that you must present proof of identity to appropriate election officials when voting, it could mean that the process has to change for how provisional ballots are cast, making it much harder. There are some states in the country that require people to show up to the election board in person and show their ID after they've already voted to have their provisional vote counted. For many Oklahomans living in rural counties or people who don't have access to reliable transportation, this could be an extra step that is simply too hard to overcome to have their vote counted. The requirements in State Question 846 could make this a reality, meaning that people will lose an opportunity to vote. In addition to provisional voting, State Question 846 could also severely restrict access to mail-in voting. So currently, any registered voter in Oklahoma has the right to vote by mail. To do so, they must request an absentee ballot by providing identifying information. This could look like going to the voter portal and filling out your information and requesting a ballot. You can show up in person, you can fill out a form physically and mail it in. But once this information is checked and your identity is verified and you get your ballot to vote by mail, people have to have their ballot notarized by a notary public, which requires proving their identity to the notary. This method is extremely secure, meaning that mail-in voting at large, and especially Oklahoma's mail-in voting process, is secure and safe and accurate. However, if State Question 846 were to go into effect, it would likely require the state legislature to significantly change this process and make it even more restrictive. State Question 846 states that voters must present proof of identity to the appropriate election official when voting. Notaries are not deemed election officials under Oklahoma law, which means people voting by mail would likely have to find another way to present and prove their identity to election officials by mail. It's unclear how this would work in practice, but it is likely that the current system, which is already very secure, would not meet the requirements set out by State Question 846. There are some states that require people voting by mail to include a photocopy of their ID with their absentee ballot. This would be yet another hoop that mail-in voters would have to jump through, and one that many people would not be able to access. Access to printing is limited and sometimes costs money that people can't afford. Mail-in voting makes voting much more accessible to people who would otherwise be unable to vote in person, like people with certain disabilities, people who work far from home, and people without access to reliable transportation. State Question 846 puts these people's, and many more people's, ability to vote and access the ballot in jeopardy. So why do people think that we need to pass State Question 846? Lawmakers who supported this bill while it was still moving through the legislature often claim that Oklahoma needs State Question 846 to prevent fraud in our elections. But there are two problems with that argument. The first is that the Oklahoma Constitution already gives the legislature the power to prevent fraud in our elections. That's in Article 3, Section 4 of our state constitution. Secondly, Oklahoma has some of the country's most secure and accurate elections. The Heritage Foundation ranks Oklahoma as number 7 in the country for election integrity. The audits of our elections regularly come back as showing that we have accurate and safe elections in our state. This tells us that the Constitution as it stands already gives the legislature enough power to make our elections safe and secure. On the other hand, opponents to State Question 846 have some concerns. Many opponents are rightfully concerned about the potential impacts to mail-in and provisional voting. Making these processes even more restrictive and difficult to access would mean fewer people get to exercise their right to vote. There are also concerns about giving the legislature broader authority over voter ID laws. Under the existing Constitution, the legislature has the authority to pass laws necessary to prevent fraud in our elections. That's already a very broad power, but it is limited. Right now, lawmakers must balance preventing fraud with maintaining access to the ballot. Giving legislators the authority to pass voter ID laws beyond simply preventing fraud could potentially open the door to more restrictive requirements that are harder to challenge in court. I hope that this video has helped you understand State Question 846 a little bit better and makes you more confident to vote on August 25th. If you have any questions, please feel free to visit our website at okpolicy.org. Thank you.